Welcome to today's General Counsel or GC Advantage webinar. Why I'm calling it a General Counsel Advantage webinar, I've never done that before, but and the topic today is the top need to know in-house counsel compensation trends. That's a mouthful too. My name is Bob Barker, and thanks for joining us today. For those who are not familiar with our firm, we help clients build, develop, and optimize their legal and compliance function. We recruit general counsel, any in-house counsel that reports into the GC, as well as CCOs. And we also provide coaching, mentoring, and advising to really help accelerate your success. As I like to say, we help unlock leadership potential and unleash organizational success. The GC Advantage program is our professional development program for legal and compliance leaders. It provides an opportunity for you to interact with GCs, CCOs. Sometimes we have CEOs and board members or executive search consultants participate to really gain some insights to help advance your career. Today's webinar is being recorded, and an email will be sent to everyone once the materials are up on our website. We also have on-demand webinars. So these are webinars that we've hosted previously that are available at any time, with the recording. You can listen to a podcast, as well as if there's any slides with that webinar. Our next GC Advantage webinar is going to be from startup through IPO. And it's really about the general counsel's journey of transformation as the company changes. Jennifer Pileggi, who's one of the GC senior advisors and a former GC of multiple tech companies, will lead the webinar. And joining her will be 3 GCs with experience of taking companies, right up through the startup through IPO. And, we encourage you to submit questions today. That's in the Zoom application. There's a little Q&A icon. If you'd use that, you can view if there's already questions that are similar to what you have. And if that's the case, just use the thumbs up icon so we'll know it's a popular question. And we'll do our best to answer the questions submitted by the end of today's webinar. And we're fortunate to have 3 experts from our team join us today to share information, insights, and tips about compensation. And so I'll turn it over to today's host, Dave Yawman, BG Senior Advisor and former EVP GC and Corporate Secretary from PepsiCo. Thanks, Dave.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for kicking us off there. And look, I remember back from the days of billable hours, we would often reflect, I think, within the firm that there were at times some hours that were super productive and well worth it, and other hours that were a little less productive. We aspire to make this hour as fast moving and as productive as possible. So buckle your seatbelts. We have a lot to kind of talk about, and compensation typically triggers people into a lot of thoughts and a lot of spaces. And as Bob referenced, feel free as we go along to kind of load up some questions as we go. We'll get to as many as we can. We'll definitely leave some time at the end, and we'll hit some along the way if something pops up that's really interesting. But we're 3 of us are going to have a chance to kind of share some insights and perspectives with you. And I'm thrilled that both John and Mary are here as panelists. And so John, you just met Bob Barker. John is the other co-founder of BarkerGilmore, currently a managing director, and leads the recruitment function at BarkerGilmore, the recruitment practice at BarkerGilmore. And I think at last count, John's been in the search and executive search space for over 3 decades, 30 plus years. And these days, he essentially lives right in that space between boards and senior executives who are out there looking for the best legal and compliance talent they can find, and the talent that exists in the market, the candidates that exist in the market. So he just lives right in that space in the search process, trying to match up the best candidates for the best roles, and ultimately trying to deliver great talent into companies that need it. And so needless to say, compensation plays heavily into that space, and we're going to benefit from John's perspective in a few minutes about kind of what's going on in the search space. Mary Rombaut is the head of marketing, research, and analytics at BarkerGilmore. Among the many other things that I think Mary does inside the firm, she is really the primary architect behind the annual compensation reports that BarkerGilmore puts out each year. I remember from my times as GC, long before I became affiliated with BarkerGilmore, I was downloading some of those reports and trying to keep tabs on what was going on in terms of market trends in the compensation space. Mary's kind of behind the scenes of that. She's going to take us into some of those reports, and BarkerGilmore does a really good job of putting out in-house compensation specific reports every year, but also reports on the compliance function. They've also done a compensation report a couple months ago on the PE and portfolio company space, so really looking specifically into kind of the private company space, and just recently put out an industry-specific compensation report in the healthcare and life sciences space. So we'll benefit from Mary's thoughts in a few minutes. And I spent a few decades at PepsiCo. I frankly went through different phases of both growth from a resources perspective, as well as constraints or cuts from resources. I was actually the head of compliance and ethics for PepsiCo at a time when we were building out the function and expanding it internationally. So we really had a tailwind of resources, and we're out trying to recruit, hire, and kind of put into place a broader team. Later, as general counsel at PepsiCo, I essentially oversaw 4 different departments, had about 650 folks all around the globe in different markets and different functions at different levels, and was in the spot where I both had to kind of understand when it was time to advocate for resources or when it was time to try to hold the cuts to a minimum, and ultimately was in a lot of compensation discussions one-on-one with a lot of members of my team. So I had a lot of perspective from an in-house perspective, and hope to bring and share some of that with you today. So let's just talk about the context of what we're talking about for the next 55 minutes here. Needless to say, compensation is a big part of your job, a big part of your career. We all, I think, are fortunate to actually work in the legal or compliance industry, which is a fairly high-paying industry overall. And so if you have a good, solid, successful career that hopefully is professionally satisfying to you, but if you have that kind of career in the industry in which many of us on this webinar work, we're probably going to do okay financially. You're going to make enough to take care of your family and take care of yourself. And that's really the good news. A year ago, we actually held a separate webinar, and the slide that you're looking at is from that webinar. It was a webinar entitled "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" which is out there and available on BarkerGilmore's website. And that webinar really was an attempt to try to answer that question, should I stay or should I go? And looked at a lot of the factors that go into that kind of decision. Hey, should I make a move? Should I stay where I'm at? How do I manage my career? And a whole plethora of issues that we talked about on that webinar. And as you see highlighted, compensation is certainly one of those factors. What are the financial benefits of the job? What are the financial terms that you're working under? And how do you advance in your career, both substantively, but in that case, financially as well? And so we put this slide up and remind you of that webinar just to make sure that everybody's considering all the factors that should go into whether to take a new job or to make a move. But we're certainly going to deep dive on compensation today. And our caveat is, hey, I had an old mentor that used to tell me, if you ever take a job just for the money, you're probably going to be dissatisfied a relatively short time later. And I think that's sage advice. If you elevate kind of the compensation element of a job to the first factor on this multitude of factors list in terms of whether to take a new job or to stay in the job you're at, it may seem appealing in the short run and stuff, but the mission really is to find a job, find a career, and make sure that you got satisfaction going on for 5, 10, or 15 years rather than just in the short term. So finance, but we're going to deep dive on compensation today. We just wanted to keep all these factors alive, but we're definitely going to deep dive on the compensation topic today. So let's get after it. Here's the 3 chapters that we hope to go at, and I kind of teed them up a little bit as I introduced some of my colleagues. Mary's going to take us into the compensation reports. John's going to take us kind of into that search space and talk to kind of how some compensation issues play in the search process. and ultimately kind of even give us some insights as to the things you should be thinking about or how the distinctions play out between private companies and public companies. How do you deal with issues like abandoned compensation when you're leaving behind unvested equity, or you're leaving behind an unpaid bonus? Can you play with that in the search process? How do you negotiate that in the search process? He lives in that space quite frequently and every day. And I'll bring some perspective from the in-house side, both from an employee perspective, meaning, hey, as an employee, when is it a right time? Or, hey, should I make an ask for a bump or a raise or an increase in comp? What are the things I should be thinking about before I actually make an ask? And if I do make an ask, what should I be thinking about as I go and make that ask? And then we'll flip the coin over a little bit and talk about some of the factors as a manager or as the head of a department, the things that you should be thinking about, or how best to respond to that kind of ask if you're on the receiving end of an ask from one of your folks. And so 3 chapters to this kind of discussion, and then we're going to try to leave time for questions and answers as we go. So let's take that slide down, and we'll turn to you first, Mary. I referenced all the great reports that BarkerGilmore puts out each year and stuff. I was hopeful that you could just kind of take us a little bit into those reports. Tell us kind of, what's in those reports. How do you get the data? What are the pluses and the minuses, the availability, and inclusive, or not just what's in those reports, but also maybe what are some of the limitations, or what do people not see that might be relevant to them from those reports?
Thank you, Dave. So obviously, compensation reports are an excellent tool to help you understand how your compensation compares to your peers. It does help you benchmark kind of where you sit within your industry, within your company type. Each March, BarkerGilmore does send out our survey to a random sample of in-house and compliance talent. So, next March, please be on the lookout for our emails so that you can participate and make our data as strong as it can possibly be. We typically receive over 3,000 responses, which is really great. And with those responses, as Dave mentioned, we put together our in-house compensation report, which is looking at the general counsel, managing counsel, and senior counsel levels. And then we also put together our compliance report, focusing on chief compliance officers and their direct reports. New this year, we did a private equity report that also looked at the portfolio companies within each private equity space. And then also last week, we released our healthcare and life sciences report. These reports, the most valid reports are analyzing the data, the compensation data based on medians rather than averages, because when there's a lot of outliers in what is self-reported and just what exists in the marketplace. So by reporting on medians, it helps us kind of eliminate those outliers. And but you also have to be aware that there's variation, obviously, under the median and over the median. Most companies, including BarkerGilmore or anybody, putting out compensation reports, are going to kind of group the analysis by company size, company type. So is it a private, public, portfolio company, the industry, and location? Those 4 variables really, are about the company itself and have a lot of influence in terms of the type of or how much compensation a position pays. But it's really, the personal factors that account for the most variance. So how many years of experience do you have? Where did you go to law school? What type of law firm experience do you have? In the case of compliance professionals, do you have a JD or don't you? That can play a huge factor. And, in the reports themselves, we break out, cash compensation by base and bonus, and then the long-term incentives, so stock options, performance shares, restricted cash. With any compensation report, you need to be able to look at the different charts and kind of put them together. You can't just look at one chart and say, I work at a private company, 1 billion to 5 billion in revenue. this is how much a general counsel makes at that company, so that's what I should be making. Well, no, as I was, trying to explain, you need to look at the other charts and be able to say, like, okay, who am I as a person? How many years experience do I have? Do I have law firm experience? And you have to kind of be able to piece it all together, because obviously every individual has a different background. Each company is different, so we can't give you all the different variations in any given report. So you kind of have to be able to look at it and say, all right, even as a manager, I'm looking for somebody cream of the crop, with a lot of experience, very tenured. I'm going to have to pay more for that, right? Rather than just look at this median of my company type and revenue size. And I think that, I think that it's a struggle sometimes for people, because you want to just see the black and white number, but in the end, compensation isn't black and white. It very much is dependent on all of these different factors. And, as Dave was saying, there's certainly limitations to these reports. One being, can you read them and kind of piece all that together and know what you're looking at? And then also understanding, cash compensation is important, but it isn't everything. So paying close attention to the long-term incentives that are reported, and understanding that they're dependent on the performance of a company, right? So when you're responding to our survey and you're answering, okay, this is what I think my long-term incentive looks like, it may be much higher than that in the end. It may be much lower, or you may leave the job and get a different, amount. So that you have to kind of be aware that this is self-reported. You're kind of, obviously, base and bonus, we're asking you to respond on what you actually received. But in terms of that long-term piece, that is a significant factor in a person's total comp package, and there's a lot of factors that as John will speak to that impact that.
It's a great point, Mary. I remember when I was looking at those reports, really as the head of the department, but also as just an employee trying to figure out whether I was fairly paid, and I would try to at least use it kind of as my own individual reference point. And I found that, hey, it kind of provided some guardrails and kind of some shaping directionally of kind of where I was, but didn't really quite answer all the specifics that I was kind of craving as an individual. But at the same time, as a department leader, it was actually really quite helpful to me to kind of understand, certainly for my case, the larger company space, some pure companies, I could get some data and understand as I went and advocated for more department resources or comp levels within my department. It was a useful tool to me. I don't know, for me, at least, almost a little bit more as a department leader or a manager, in some cases for HR professionals who might be on this webinar as well, than it was as an individual, just because there's so many, as you were saying, so many individual factors that go into the compensation package for a person.
Definitely. And obviously an advantage when you're working with a firm such as ours is, when you have a role that you need to fill, we can run it much more specific to a company's scenario, right? Or, what they're looking for. But in the reports themselves, we try to give as broad of a perspective as possible, but we can't hit all the scenarios.
Right. And you couldn't, we didn't script this, but if you scripted a segue right to John's, chapter, it would have been perfect. So thanks very much for that, Mary. And just, reminder, all those reports are available on the BarkerGilmore site, and there's other ones in the market as well and stuff. So, use them as you can, just to inform yourself about what's going on in the market. But let's segue into where Mary was just taking us. Hey, when we get into a search process, or when you get into a tailored position and you start talking about specific candidates, now we can really start honing in on kind of what those compensation issues are. And that takes us right into the space that John just kind of owns on a day-to-day basis. And so let's start going there, John, in terms of the search process and how compensation plays into that space. But maybe before we dive specifically into the comp issues, maybe you could just give us a little bit of insight about like what's going on in the market right now. What are the market trends that you're seeing right now? And ultimately, as you go out and kind of develop slates of candidates and stuff, what are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you hearing right now, as we are in the, later parts of 2023?
Absolutely. That's a great way to start this off. First of all, we're thrilled to say that the general counsel marketplace itself is, as I predicted a year ago, it's booming. We have more GC searches on our plate than ever before, and for all different reasons. We have general counsel who are retiring. We have general counsel aren't keeping up with the growth and strategy of the company. We have new CEOs coming on board who are looking for different talent. And surprisingly, we have 2 searches going on right now where the general counsel made significant amount of money and they want to do something mission driven. So they're actually looking to step aside, let someone else take over the role. So we're thrilled with the opportunity out there. There's opportunity at some of the smaller or some of the PE portco companies for development opportunities where someone's reaching to become general counsel. On the Fortune 500 side, one of the trends that we're seeing is more experience trumps less experience. The CEO, and we've been told this by 2 CEOs just recently, we're looking for someone that is board tested, not board ready. So that ability to the report to the CEO, report to the board, and balance that dual reporting structure so that it works for everyone. That's really the critical component.
Yeah, got it. And so you get into a specific search, you get it scoped by the board or the CEO or the head of HR, whoever is kind of, bringing you on board. You go out and identify a slate of candidates, you boil it down through some interview process. How do the compensation issues when do they come into play? How do they come into play? Like, what does that feel and look like relative to the search process?
They come into play right from the very start. So we have an alignment meeting right away. I will say, if someone's complaining about their comp, many times it's a question of what are the comp consultants sharing with your comp committee to say what you should be being paid. So we find sometimes we hear from CHRO, well, this is what our comp consultants are sharing with us, and we're scratching our heads saying, I'm not sure where they're getting these numbers. So the numbers start right from the start. We do have some variability. I think you both said that, if you get an all-star that can come in and hit the ground running with proven experience, the companies are willing to pay a little bit more. That said, you have a corporate structure. You have what you're paying the CEO, what you're paying the CFO. General counsel is going to come in a bit lighter than the CFO. So there's a certain structure that they have to work with. So there's a little bit of room to negotiate. But for the most part, we know walking in the door when we're starting a search exactly what our clients' targets are, and we try to keep in that range. So if we're reaching out to you and you're saying I need $2 million and my search is paying $1.5 million, or I'm paying $2 million and you're looking for $4 million, we're happy to take your referral, but it's not the right opportunity. So we're looking for the motivation. Obviously, like you said earlier, it shouldn't be just about the money. But that said, we're looking to present people that we know we can close in the long run. So if you're out of our ballpark, you're out of our ballpark. It's probably not the right search.
Yeah. Hey, there was a quick question, and John, I think I know the answer, but I'll let you answer it and stuff. Is there any way for folks on the call to see what the GC opportunities are in the market, or those confidential searches that you got going on?
That actually is a great question too. If someone's interested in sharing their information with us, we're happy to provide any search that's an appropriate fit. In fact, I highly recommend anyone out there get on our radar, because what we look at first are the people who are on our radar, and we don't have what we're looking for, we expand that reach. But we don't advertise our positions on purpose. When we did advertise positions years ago, it's a funny thing. Most every lawyer thought they were qualified for every one of our positions, and every company, every position's specification, the CEO or the board has very specific areas that they're interested in, and trying to describe to everyone, it typically turned into a long drawn-out process. Informing them why they weren't exactly right or what we were looking for the search took too much time up. So again, get on our radar. We're happy if there's an opportunity that's the right fit for you. We're the first to reach out and share the details.
And do you guys do anything in-house relative to, it's another question, helping people understand whether they're being fairly paid, or is that a little bit of a step too far in terms of kind of using?
No, I think that's part of the whole getting to know you process. We have plenty of people that maybe aren't actively looking for something new, but they're open to opportunities. I think everyone should be opportunity driven. But we get an understanding of where you're coming from now and what it would take to get your attention for something new. And, what, of course, we're not allowed technically to ask, what are you making? But I will say for professionals at this level making this kind of money, people are pretty forthright, and our clients are typically looking for, a good appreciation for where you're coming from. If you're an NEO of a public company, obviously that doesn't really come into play, but we're happy to say if we think we could do better, and we're happy, and we're not going to set expectations that we can't hit down the road, put it that way.
How do folks get on the radar, your radar? Who do they reach? Is there a place on the website to go through, or
there is a place on the website to submit the information. Everyone knows my email. I get plenty of unsolicited mail on a regular basis, and I'm happy to reach out and inform people, connect with people, get to know them. Whether it's helping them or helping their colleagues, we're all about networking in this business. Just as much as we're interested in helping others, it's amazing how, and one of the things I appreciate most being in the legal recruiting business, lawyers are really driven to help others. They all have friends that need help, or they have a friend that's looking to make a strategic hire, and the referral business is really a really big component of our business.
John, you touched upon, the relatively new restrictions on being able to ask about compensation. You made a quick point about it and stuff, but is there are you seeing other things, or how has that played out kind of, in terms of your experience in the search process?
The HR departments are the ones that know the rules more than anyone, and yet they're the first to ask, what are they specifically making? And they want all the details. My advice, we don't ask people what they're earning, but we ask what they take, and being candid and forthright. This is where I'm coming from. This is what I'm looking for. I am a believer you should get paid based on the job, the opportunity. You shouldn't be getting paid based on where you're coming from today. If there, again, there's a level of cooperation that it takes, but we're ultimately trying to get the best offer possible to get someone excited about accepting the position and sticking around. We get measured not only by our search success rate, making the placement happen, we get measured by what's the stick rate. So we're looking to place lawyers that are sticking around 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That's our objective.
Yeah, got it. Back in the day, John, there were some folks that would say, hey, I'm willing to make a move, but it's got to be, for those that are comp oriented, it's got to be a 10% bump or a 20% bump and stuff. Thoughts about kind of setting those parameters inside your own head?
Yeah, those numbers, that was the way people did it. But if you're looking at, I think Mary just touched on this, if you're looking at the last 5 years, the revenue growth, the earnings growth for general counsel has boomed, and it's out of control, especially in certain sectors like the technology sector, where it's probably more than double what it was in 2018. So, the comp will go up, but you have to be long-term focused. You have to focus on, what is the company's product? What's the company's service? What's the quality of talent? I measure how good a leader is to work for based on, 1, the quality of people they hire, 2, how long those people stick around. So do your homework. Make sure I had one of my all-time favorite stories is early on, I placed a general counsel at a pre-IPO company, and the GC was kicking and screaming about $20,000 walking in the door. And finally, he was going to turn the job down over $20,000. He thought, hopefully he's not on this call today. Maybe he is. If he'll have a good laugh and send me an email. Anyway, CEO finally looks at me and goes, John, step aside. You don't know what you're doing. This guy's not looking at the big term picture. Let me get involved and make sure he understands the value of the equity award I'm giving him. And so fortunate for this general counsel, he accepted the offer and went to work there. The company's been through 3 transactions. I know firsthand the guy's building the biggest home in Boston right now. He couldn't be wealthier. And I want to say to him every day, aren't you glad you didn't let $20,000 stand in the way? So you really have to say, how much respect or appreciation do you have for that leadership team? How much are you passionate or interested or respect the product or service that they're offering, and believe in the long-term advantage? I mean, that's really what it's going to come. The big money comes on the back end, not on the front end.
Yeah, that's great. It's so true. There is a question on here that I'll segue into a separate issue as well. But the question from the audience is there a way to protect yourself from being lowballed But let me add on to that, any perspective that you have about how do you deal with some of the compensation that you're leaving behind, some of that unvested equity, the unpaid bonus, something like that, and you're trying to negotiate some makeup, of that from the hiring company and stuff, because that strikes me as a way that you can get lowballed a bit in there potentially. So let me segue or combine those two and see.
You can. First and foremost, it's all about documentation. You don't just say someone, I'm walking away from $1 million, pay me $1 million. So one is you need the documentation. Two, the way it works is you don't just get the whole package. And the company you're moving to is going to offer an equity component. So they're looking that you're going to replace some of your equity you're leaving on the table with their equity. So what happens is typically the first year, what are you going to walk away from year one? How much cash, how much equity? They typically try to cover that. The second year will be a prorated amount, maybe say 50%. Third year, maybe none, maybe a smaller component. So if you have $1 million, look at here's year one, here's year two, here's year three, break it out and show. And again, it's the value that you're bringing this organization. That's going to make the difference in getting them excited about you coming to the organization.
Yeah. And a separate question from the audience about making a jump from private to public companies. And there's reference in at least in the question that it seems very difficult to jump from a private company to a public company, that the public companies are looking for public company experience and stuff. And as you answer that with some perspective on that, can you also touch upon some of the differences that show up when you're in the middle of a compensation discussion with a public, a hiring company that's public and a hiring company that's a PE shop or a private company?
For sure. The biggest difference is really in the long-term incentive. So when you're going to a private equity portco, you're going to get a lump sum of equity walking in the door. And then whenever a transaction occurs down the road, there's going to be a certain, whether it's 3x, 4x, 5x. Most of these companies are looking for that 3 to 6x type of return on their initial investment. And based on that return on investment, that's how many times you'll pay out. So, be mindful of what is the percentage that you're getting? Is 1%, 1.25%, 1.5% of the valuation. And then you're just going to have to ride out, everybody's rowing in the same direction for the same success. On a public company, it's, you're going to be getting an annual incentive. And like I said, an annual incentive award, it's typically the form of that, meaning restricted stock units, performance shares, a long-term cash. It's typically the same for every member of the ELT. So it's not really a lot of negotiating. I will say that the question about making a move from private company to public company, it as you could probably talk better about it than me, but being in that situation from a public company, it is not an easy transition. It's doable. I see it done.
It's not
an easy transition.
Yeah, well, and to your point, look, there's a lot of the big company. I had the experience of working at a really large company. We had a lot of different legal jobs that required a lot of different expertise from a legal perspective, whether it was IP or just raw litigation skills or what have you and stuff. The public company certainly was an important part of it, but it wasn't the exclusive skill set that we were looking for. So there's definitely an opportunity, I think, to make the jump from a private company to a public company, but it probably goes to a larger public company that has a lot of different elements and aspects to its law department, and you got to find that you can kind of segue into. Would be
and I wouldn't think less of a person if you're at a private company versus a public company. Many GCs of private companies go to me. They're thrilled not to have that public company reporting responsibility, and it's just a different way to operate. And I watch people in those private companies do financially extremely well. So just because you're at a private company doesn't mean you're an underdog to someone at a public company. Most people that are at leadership roles of private companies are thrilled to be in that situation.
There's a bunch of questions popping up into the chat right now, just about kind of making that jump, making that search, or climbing into the market. But let me just segue real quick because not everybody's out there in the market trying to find the next best opportunity that's outside the current entity. Some are actually sitting at a company or an entity that they're really happy at, and they're sitting around wondering whether to make an ask or a raise or a bump. And this probably takes it into my chapter a little bit, just from my experience at PepsiCo. And so what I tried to do, at least just thinking about the experience that I had and the folks that I dealt with, is if you're sitting at your current company and you're thinking about whether to make an ask for a raise or a bump or some increase in compensation, I boiled it down to thinking about 5 things that you might want to consider before you make the ask. And here they are pretty quickly. 5 things you should think about to help you decide whether to make an ask. First, understand the structure of your compensation programs inside your organization. You've heard both Mary and John talk about kind of total comp. And total comp's got a lot of elements, from base to bonus to equity to benefits, maybe some perks, maybe some other benefits, etc. There's hybrid working, there's all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of compensation programs out there, and you got to make sure that you're fully versed in all of your programs. And importantly, to understand kind of, hey, where does the company have some discretion in some of those to be able to flex the level of benefits provided in bonus targets or equity awards, and where does it not? Where is it fairly lockstep and constrained? And so it's important for you to understand your programs and understand where there's flexibility and where there's not. Second, understand your total compensation. As a department leader, I always knew what the total cost of my employees were. Each person, I understood what the total compensation cost to the company was. As an employee, you should understand the total compensation package that you're receiving. As John was saying, some of it's delayed or deferred. Sometimes vesting schedules are delayed 2 or 3 years. There's ways of valuing an equity award as of the day it's granted, even if it vests 3 years from now. That's part of your total comp, and you should understand that as much as you should understand the cash that you're bringing home on your base and your bonus each year. There's also perks and benefits. You should understand your total compensation cost and number to make sure that when you're thinking about whether you're fairly paid, that you understand the full boat. So that's 2. Number 3, understand the market. We've talked a little bit about that today. It can be a little opaque to find hardcore specific market information, but it's good for you to have a sense of where the market is, so that you understand whether you're being well paid or not, or whether your company well pays or pays well relative to peers in the industry and the geography that you're sitting in. So that's 3. 4, and this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced. 4, I think it's important, if you're going to make an ask for an increase in compensation, you should understand where your entity is right now. Like, hey, are we fiscally strong? Hey, are we really growing as an entity? Or are we fiscally strained right now? Are we struggling a little bit? Are there headwinds in our industry or for our company that are going to make it, that makes it difficult to actually, it's a tough time to make an ask. It's a tough situation, tough environment for the company to be doling out more for comp. It's important that you have kind of that perspective in your head. So that's the 4th tip. And the 5th is just to consider whether you've made an ask before. And if so, how long ago was it? What was the response? There were certain people in my shop that seemed to make an increase ask every year. And that over time, I think falls a little bit on deaf ears. I think you want to be choiceful on when you make the ask. But those are the 5 tips. And ultimately, if you decide to make the ask, if you decide to go forward and make an ask, super important that you actually are grounded in the rationale for why you're making the ask. The easiest is, hey, you've taken on more work, or you've been, heroic in the amount of work that's been going on, and you just feel like your job has expanded. That's a great rationale for essentially articulating an ask for why you should get an increase in compensation. So that's one possible rationale. I've been working more. I have more to do. The scope of my roles increased. That's a great rationale. 2 others may be, hey, I believe I'm underpaid relative to my internal peers, and that there's essentially a compensation equity gap internally. People find that out in different ways. They might have perceptions that don't meet reality, but you may actually, ideally, good department heads, we would do it at PepsiCo, would do proactive equity reviews and try to make sure that folks doing the same kind of work were paid, if not equally right, that there was rationale for why they were paid differently. And there's a whole structure for doing pay equity comparisons and stuff. You may be able to ask for one, but that might be another rationale for why you want to ask for an increase, because you think you're underpaid relative to internal equity. And the last point is just you feel like you're underpaid relative to the market, which we touched upon a little bit more. 2 other things to think about. I think about who to approach and when. So if you're going to make an ask, I think it's always good to go to your manager first. Don't sideswipe your manager. Ultimately, you want him or her as your manager to be advocating for you. There may be other folks within the company, whether it's the HR department or finance or whomever that's going to pass on this. You want your manager advocating for you. So it's always a good place to go first. And I think you got to think about whether there's an annual cycle for making these kind of asks or whether you're going to make an off-cycle ask. A lot of companies have kind of an annual process or a biannual process where this comes up. If you're going to go off-cycle, it's probably a little bit more difficult, but maybe it'll help, prime the pump for when the cycle comes around and stuff. So think about the timing and who to ask. And then my last tip, if you're looking to make an ask, is just pre-think your reaction, regardless of what the response is going to be. Like, what are you going to feel and how much is it going to affect you if the response comes back as a no? Maybe it comes back with no and an articulation that's acceptable as to why. Maybe the answer is yes, but you should pre-think about how that's going to impact your motivation, your desire to stay, your sense of value or contribution or what have you, so that you're not caught off guard. Obviously, making an ask is something that you should feel comfortable doing if you feel like it's appropriate, but you should be prepared to hear whatever the response is. And then let me flip over the coin real quickly because I want to go back to Q&A. Let me go back and flip over the coin. If you're a manager or if you're a department leader, here are some things that, at least from my experience and talking to some of my other GC peers, kind of some things to think about to proactively handle compensation issues as the head of a department or the manager of a team. A little bit parallel to the tips for the employees or for the askers. But first is know your organization, know the compensation programs that you're working with. Totally. I was always surprised when certain of my peers within PepsiCo or even some of the people that were people leaders that reported to me weren't fully versed in our compensation bands, our base salary bands, our bonus targets, how they're calculated, where we had discretion relative to bonus payouts, the equity awards. There were different times where they were lockstep. There were different times where we had discretionary equity awards. Really important to stay abreast and make sure that you're well-versed in all the programs in your organization. And again, where you have discretion and where you don't. Second, know the market, stay abreast. I referenced how I used to download the BarkerGilmore and other equity or other compensation reports. And that was just my way of trying to stay abreast as to where we at PepsiCo were kind of paying relative to the market. It helped me advocate for more resources or ultimately articulate that, no, I think we're in the good spot where we are where we need to be. Sometimes it helps to bring those reports and look at them together with your HR partner or your HR colleagues. And I often found myself sometimes taking those reports and sending them to our compensation department with inside PepsiCo to make sure that they were getting industry, meaning legal or compliance industry specific compensation reports, because the market for legal and compliance talent is a little bit more high priced than some other functions within the company. And so it was important for me, I thought, as a manager or department leader, to help the HR department stay abreast of compensation trends relative to the groups and the functions that I oversaw at PepsiCo. So know the market. Third, I think it's really important you prioritize people and their compensation. I mean, you as a leader have a lot to do. You got a lot of substantive issues to handle, but part of your job is to think about your people, and part of thinking about people is what they're being paid. And I think you got to step into their shoes and proactively think about them. Think about, where they're being paid, who's taking on more work. Is there equity? As I mentioned, we used to do internal equity reviews every year that I think I was at PepsiCo. They were very proactive about doing that, which really helped. And we would literally make some equity bumps every year internally. And there was good kind of broad-based support for that within PepsiCo, which was a really healthy place to work and a really welcome place to work. A lot of times you review compensation once a year around performance time, which is fine, but you want to make sure that you're staying focused on that and you keep people and compensation prioritized. And two other quick ones. Fourth, be proactive. Compensation issues are always best dealt with proactively rather than reactively, especially when it comes to kind of folks that have taken on more or your high talent. I think the best moments and the most impact that I ever had as a leader was when I surprised people or proactively brought compensation raises to them almost before they were making an ask or before they were expecting it. If you're in a position to be able to do that, that's awesome. It's often when the company's got some tailwind behind it, it's doing pretty well. There were other times relative to being proactive that I had to get out in front and try to minimize the cost cuts or the decreases that we were going to confront because of where we were as a company. And sometimes getting out in front of that and try to proactively dealing with some of that, put my team in the best position so that I could minimize the cuts. But the takeaway is to make sure that you're proactive as a leader on these issues. And last, and maybe the toughest one to do, is to make the tough decisions. Ultimately, your job as a leader or as a manager or a department leader, I always thought I had to develop a very merit-based mentality and make the tough calls, because everybody can't get paid the same. There actually has to be differences, and those are the tough decisions, especially when it comes to people. You need to know who your best players are. Ultimately, you always have limited resources, and you have to allocate them where you can get the best ROI. And in the people space, that means making bets on your best talent and making sure that you're tilting whatever comp you can and whatever flexibility you have more in their direction than in others. You got to try to avoid the peanut butter, approach where you're just spreading it thin to everybody. That kind of minimizes the impact, even if it feels like you're keeping everybody happy. So it's important to kind of be prepared, be a leader, and make the tough calls and bet on your best talent. So a couple of thoughts from my perspective for both the employee as well as the department leader and as a manager as well. And with that, I'm going to shut up and try to get back to Q&A because a lot of it's come in here. We have a bunch of questions. I'm just going to there's a couple of questions in here, by the way, that I've seen that kind of climb into some data, some averages, some median pay for different levels, different folks, and not to disregard those questions because they're valid questions. I think some of those will be answered in the compensation reports, probably as good as we could answer them live. So I'm going to kind of just try to get to some of the other questions that might not show up. I don't know, it show up in a report per se or as data and stuff. So one, I'm kind of randomly checking one. How does a deputy GC or an assistant GC working on day-to-day operations get the strategic experience companies look for in a GC hire? So John, you've probably seen a bunch of resumes. People have progression. I certainly had people in my shop that I was trying to progress through roles. I'll just quickly say, and then I'll flip it to you for a thought. Relative to my best talent that I thought were developable, my mission was always to keep them growing. And so sometimes the growth isn't so vertical as it is horizontal. And so relative to what you can do, if you're growing and you're taking on a certain set of accountabilities, there may be ways to expand horizontally your skill set and take on things that are more lateral to you, but expand your knowledge base. Even if they're not advancing you vertically at that point in time from a compensation or leveling perspective, but it broadens your skill set and ultimately puts more kind of arrows in your quiver, to take to market if that's what you choose and stuff. But John, I don't know if you have a thought or what you see on people's resumes or experiences or what have you.
Well, it is something that you are personally responsible for raising your hand and making it known that you're looking for that experience. Most GCs are succession planning mindful. So they understand that you need to get that board exposure to really be considered for a general counsel, whether it's an internal promotion or external. And I would just say most general counsels they're humble and they enjoy giving that responsibility to help develop others. And they're equally as happy if you get promoted from within or even move to another major corporation as the general counsel. I have plenty of general counsel keeping score by how many that they've helped promote. But again, I would say you need to raise your hand and make sure that the GC is aware that you're mindful that you need that experience. You would hope you would be getting that anyway because the GC would be succession minded. But I would just say raise your hand. I will say, without that board experience, it's a tough move, especially in a public company. You would probably have a better opportunity to move to, like I say, a private equity portco, which is not a bad thing either, because most of those portcos, their 5-year plan is either become public or be sold to a bigger PE firm. So there's opportunity to still become a public company GC with that transition to a portco.
Yeah, it's a great Great point, John. We used to, I mentioned I was the prior head of compliance and ethics. And in that role, I actually reported to the board and gave reports and met frequently with the audit committee, et cetera, from that role, even though I reported to the general counsel. So the role was a super high exposure role relative to board interactions. And as other lawyers came behind me and we were trying to essentially recruit from the law department into compliance and ethics as an experiential growth thing. A lot of business lawyers don't like to come into compliance and ethics. There's a little bit of a barrier there for some people in their heads, but some of the selling point was, hey, there's more board exposure over here and you see the company from a different lens, but it expands the experience.
That was a smart move.
Yeah.
On your part. Obviously played out well.
It played out well, but both my successor at PepsiCo is also the former head of compliance and ethics. So there was a little bit of a track record. John, another question, just maybe a quick thought. What about going from a small public company to a big public company? Is that hard to do? Do you see that path?
Well, it first of all, it's done regularly, and that's what I recommend. If anyone's looking to become a general counsel, first become a general counsel. You're general counsel of a public company. Maybe it's a 500 million or $1 billion, and then you work your way up through, to the next level. It's not an easy task to jump from $1 billion company to a $10 billion company, but it allows you to make that progression. So I say, if you have the opportunity to become a GC of a smaller company, especially a smaller public company, that's the way in. That's your ticket. Once you are the public company GC, now you are one. Now you can leverage that for bigger, better opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's good advice too. And hey, Mary, maybe one for you. I'm going to try to summarize the question. It's a little long in terms of the words and stuff, but a lot of folks on the call or the webinar, are familiar with kind of the AmLaw 100 and the kind of the pay, pay rates and the pay levels at AmLaw and how they drop off to the AmLaw 200. So there's kind of this tiering of pay scales between the firms. And by analogy, there's a question kind of around, hey, you know what, I work at a kind of a smaller tech company and stuff. I have 36, attorneys. I pay them blank. Is there any way to kind of get into looking at the pay levels for kind of the top tier tech companies versus the next tier? So you got kind of the Google, the Metas, the Apples on top, the next tier down and stuff. Is there tiering within industries? And maybe I'm analogizing to the healthcare and life sciences report, which was industry specific, just by analogy to this question and stuff. But is there a way to look at comp levels kind of within an industry by kind of the size of the company?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, obviously every industry has sub-industries, right? And we definitely see variance within those sub-industries, and then based on the revenue of those companies within each sub-industry. It's tough to go into all those, if you're working with us, obviously that's a lot easier to be able to share that information. But when you're looking at a report, like one of our reports, for example, what I would encourage you to do would be to say, okay, let me look to see where the technology industry in general fell in terms of all the industries last year, right? Like where were they in terms of total compensation compared to everybody else? Then you look at the position level that you're looking to hire. So say it's a managing counsel, and let's say I can't remember off the top of my head, but let's say technology was, around 10% higher than the other industries. You want to be able to then extrapolate and say, okay, this is the median, but because I'm in the tech industry or my revenue is in this, within this bucket, I need to add 10%, decrease it 10%, whatever, you know what I mean? So you got to kind of take the different pieces and say, here's my revenue, here's my industry, here's the position. And then these are the variables about the person I'm looking for and how that influences it, and kind of be able to put those pieces together if you're trying to do it on your own versus, I mean, that would be my best suggestion.
We're going to try to lightning round as many of these as we can. We got about 5 minutes left. One question, probably one for me. Can you share your thoughts on how to respond to subordinates' compensation requests when believe the answer from senior leadership is no? So you're a manager kind of within the hierarchy. You're going to get requests for compensation increases from some of your team members, and folks above you are going to push back. I think the first place that I would start is, be a leader, have your own perspective and have your own knowledge base as to whether the person that's on your team is fairly paid and adequately paid. and have your own opinion as to whether that person deserves a bump or not. Ultimately, you are part of a hierarchy, so you might not hold the final call and stuff like that. But if you're in a position where you can advocate, then I think you should go try to advocate. If you're in a position that you don't believe the person's worthy or in a spot right now to kind of warrant an increase, then I think you should be honest and transparent, have some rationale for why you believe that, and just be frank and honest with the employees. My experience was, when it comes to compensation, it's personal. It's very personal, and it's a leadership moment for you to deal with somebody very honestly and very forthrightly, even if the news is bad. So I think it's super important that you just play with all the cards above the table. You don't want to blame the bosses for why the person's not getting a raise and stuff, but I think you want to be as transparent as possible and be as forthright as possible, and don't tease the person into thinking it's going to happen when it's not. I don't think that's the right way to deal with people. Hey, another go ahead, John.
I'll make one comment about whether if you're a boss or you're an employee, it's the reputation of the individual that matters most, not what they think. So what they think of themselves, their identity, I mean, that's great that you think that way, but what we ideally want is someone whose identity is on par with their reputation. So if you're going in and looking for a raise, focus on your reputation, meaning how has the business responded to you? What have they told you where you're bringing the most value to the organization? And same thing if you're a manager and you're talking to an employee. If the business isn't bringing back those glamorous reports about the reputation, it's time to lay the cards on the table and let them know. I'll also say this, one of my favorite interview questions: how have your responsibilities increased since you took the job? Say you're interviewing for a GC job with me. I ask that question. I will ask that question if you interview with me. And you say, well, I pretty much have been doing the same job for the last 10 years. You know what? You're not a GC candidate. GC candidates are constantly impressing people around them, earning their trust, and gaining more responsibility. If you're not a GC candidate. So be mindful if you're going in for that raise. One, what's your reputation? What's the business sharing with you, the value that you're bringing to their organization? And two, how have you responded? You mentioned it earlier, receive a award for taking on greater responsibilities. Seek out those responsibilities. Don't wait for the responsibility to come to you. Raise your hand, let it come. So how have your responsibilities progressed? Where are you bringing the most value to the business? Not your opinion, but what you've heard factually from the business.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I love that. Hey, another question. Can you expand the discussion on the benefits of going to compliance to get board exposure and a different viewpoint? At least within PepsiCo, a lot of our business attorneys were kind of, knee deep with the business folks every single day. We're very P&L centric, and we're doing their best to essentially, knock down barriers, certainly stay within the boundaries of the law, but try to make the business move as fast as possible while minimizing risk. Great experience, great exposure. That's called being a business attorney. There's a different perspective and a different kind of role that comes with being in a compliance and ethics department, where you're trained to be a little bit more cynical and skeptical. You're a little bit more about the enterprise as a whole than you are about the specific business at times. And I'm probably broadly stating it just to be quick. But I think there's a different and expansive view that comes. And I just think you gain experience from having different roles and seeing an entity from different perspectives, which if you're not growing vertically at certain points in time, and there's an opportunity to grow horizontally, I just saw it from my experience, there was opportunities in my shop, at least, that it was possible for people to grow horizontally by jumping from the law department to compliance and ethics, ideally with a round trip ticket that would go back to legal at an appropriate time with an appropriate role. But it just helped it get greater experiences, different perspective. And some of the roles in compliance and ethics had better access actually for board exposure than some roles within kind of the business units being in the law department. So that was kind of the thought. Hey, John, any thoughts on mid-career lawyers? They're working at a company for 10, 12, 15 years. They go back to law school. They gain a law degree, and then they come back to the company, moving from a non-legal role to a legal role. How do you get credit, for the JD that you got? I would answer and stuff. There were some of those folks in my shop, and they're in a different role. The role that you had, as a non-lawyer is different than the role that you had as a lawyer. I don't think you should take a discount just because you've been a hometown person that's worked for this company and stuff. You probably went to night school and did a heroic job in getting your law degree, and now you're in a legal role. You should be paid a legal rate and stuff. So I think that's a question of advocacy for yourself and making sure that the company is trying to value you for the degree that you just got. Now, that said, you won't have a lot of the legal experience, and so you're probably at a starting rate for a lawyer. Probably in an advanced starting rate because you have a lot of experience at the company and knowledge and stuff. But I think there's a way to get value for that law degree, but I think you got to advocate for it, just keeping it within kind of perspective relative to being a relatively new lawyer. And whenever Mr. Barker turns on his camera, it means that we're like time. And so I'm going to take that as my cue to apologize to all those questions that we didn't get to. But thanks for staying on the fast-moving, quick-talking pace, and a big thanks to Mary and John for their perspective.
And to you, Dave. Bob, I'm going to just jump in 1 second. Dave, I've always thought you were a rock star, but one, we appreciate you. Everything you said today, you were amazing. But one of the things that we have to all respect and appreciate and thank you for is showing up on your family vacation at the lake house, doing this kind of thing. And we just learned prior to this meeting that Dave is a rock star, plays guitar in a band, and lighting up this little lakefront community that he's staying in. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everything that you've done here.
Cheers, John.
Thanks, Dave. And we want to just make this GC Advantage program as valuable as possible for everyone. So we appreciate your feedback. We're going to be sending just a 1-minute survey at the conclusion of this broadcast here. So please complete that at your earliest convenient, and contact us obviously if you'd like to discuss any recruiting needs, coaching needs to take your career to the next level. And again, we thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you at another GC Advantage webinar soon. Thanks, everyone.